Today, let's talk about a rule system and miniature line that I think could represent a big chunk of the future of miniature wargaming. It's one-page rules. Hey there, Philip here from Manning the Fort, and as I record this in early April 2023, despite the announcement of a new edition of a certain game, there seem to be a lot of people looking for alternatives, at least if my comments section, social media, and what I see from other content creators is any guide. If you're one of those people, or if you just want something to tide you over until you wait for that new edition of Warhammer 40k, one-page rules is probably worth a look. Now, it's basically impossible to talk about one-page rules without talking about Warhammer. Both Warhammer 40k, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and their skirmish counterparts, Warcry and Kill Team. Now, when I was first introduced to one-page rules, I was told basically, it's like Warhammer, but simpler. And while I think that description is accurate, I think it's inadequate, or at least needs more context. When I heard simpler, I thought dumbed down. And in reality, what I've found after playing it is it just means more streamlined. There's still plenty of room for tactical nuance and all that sort of thing. You just don't need to flip through 5 books in order to find it. And, you know, speaking of that new edition of 40k, I think someone might have been taking notes. Being able to keep the rules in 1 or 2 very small booklets, essentially, or PDFs, is a big part of what helps games of one-page rules run quickly. Now, while I'd like to think of myself as a big wrinkly-brained gamer man, I know I'm not in a lot of ways, and so games of something like Kill Team can take a couple hours pretty easily for me. A game of grimdark future firefight, which is one-page rules kind of alternative to that, goes from a blank table to done a lot of the time in about 45 minutes, even if one or both players are fairly new. That means if you're, say, an adult, which according to YouTube analytics most of you are, that means you've probably got a lot of responsibilities in your life and your gaming time is precious to you. I know it is to me. So a couple of hours, maybe factor in 2 hours for sure if you're accounting for setup, even if you are big brain fast player man, it really eats into it a lot more than 30 to 45 minutes. So while the rules are simple and streamlined, they get fairly regular updates. In fact, as of right now, One Page Rules is doing an across-the-board update across all of their lines and have made various iterative tweaks to a lot of the different faction rules and continue to do so on a regular basis. And since the faction rules themselves are absolutely free to download as PDFs, there's no worries about getting behind. You just go to the website every once in a while, see if there's a new version number on your favorite faction, and then download it. The basic rules to the game are also free, but as someone extremely helpfully pointed out to me in one of my earlier videos from months ago, I was like, well, you really shouldn't say one-page rules is free because the full rule book is behind a paywall. And it is. It's $5 for all of them. Fantasy, sci-fi, fantasy skirmish, sci-fi skirmish, space battles, and then some playtest content each month, things like that. So yeah, I guess technically the rules aren't free. It's also not buying 5 books at $50 to $60 a piece. Also, one nice thing when it comes to getting ready for a game of one-page rules is they have a free army building app. And get this, it actually works! And it's free! I wonder if they're taking notes about that one. Now, all of these things kind of combine to the point that I'm trying to get to, which is the game's not perfectly balanced. No game is ever perfectly balanced, but the OPR team really does seem to care about tweaking things and updating them and then giving you those updates for free in the case of faction rules and for a very low price in terms of the entire rulebooks. Something else that makes the games move really quickly is the core mechanics of one-page rules. Models and units have 2 stats. They have quality and they have defense. Quality is what you roll for almost everything. Making a morale check, it's quality. Trying to hit something, quality. Now, defense is really just used for exactly what it sounds like, defending when you get hit. There's no roll to hit, then roll to wound, then roll armor save, then yada yada yada. In OPR, it's roll to hit with quality, roll to defend with defense, and if that roll fails, then the wounds go through, essentially. Now, there are all kinds of modifiers that can be applied to that. There is a version of armor piercing. There's a lot of different, there's poison. There's a lot of different weapon special rules and armor special rules and regenerative special rules that modify things, but they only modify those two things. So you still get a lot of the nuance and a lot of the detail, and you can have a lot of fun army building, but it's a lot less bookkeeping, which means faster games, which means more games. That same principle applies to movement. Movement is 6 inches, period. But there are modifiers to that movement. If your unit is fast, it adds a couple inches. If your unit is slow, it subtracts a couple of inches, and then those effects are added on to if you're talking about running instead of simply moving and shooting or moving and fighting. In fact, the vast majority of special rules in one-page rules are universal across all factions. They are universal special rules. And actually, as I was initially writing this, it was around the time of Adepticon, and Games Workshop announced that in 10th edition 40K they would be bringing back universal special rules. It's weird. It's almost like they know they've been losing ground. Now, my actual on-the-table experience with OPR at this point has been in their skirmish scale systems, that being Grimdark Future Firefight and Age of Fantasy Skirmish. And what's the thing about it, though, is the rules translate, not just from the small-scale games to the large-scale games, but unless I'm really missing something, there's no reason I couldn't have a squad of fantasy rat men take on a squad of Battle Brothers. The rules just, they're fungible between the two game systems. And when you scale up from skirmish to full scale, the rules stay the same. Now, the points do get adjusted, I think, for various factions, and obviously the skirmish scale, you're not going to have, you know, a knight walking around in the skirmish scale game. But other than that, the rules are exactly the same. Let's talk a little bit about those faction rules I mentioned earlier, too. One-page rules has a lot of factions for both its fantasy and sci-fi games, and while a lot of them will look pretty familiar, or at least look very compatible, if you happen to have a Warhammer 40K or Age of Sigmar army, there are a few that are kind of their own unique things. Some of them, it's been suggested, are actually meant to be able to use Star Wars Legion models with, or various other things. But, I mean, you could just go really nuts, like I said earlier, and have your lizard men fighting against Necrons. Why not? They also have included rules for the skirmish games of Games Workshop, or at least reasonable, legally distinct approximations thereof. So if you're into Necromunda, if you're into the original Warcry kill bands, or warbands, there are rules that will very easily slot in with those factions. Now, on that note, let's move on to miniatures. If you have an existing collection for Warhammer or any other miniature tabletop game, be it skirmish or full scale, you're probably good to go. There's probably a faction that either very easily becomes a one-to-one with your army, or, you know, with a little bit of tweaking here and there and a little bit of hand-waving, is you can easily put what you already have on the table. But if you're interested in new models, One Page Rules has some amazing sculpts that they put out every month as part of their 3D printing subscription. I've talked about it in multiple videos. I absolutely love their stuff. As I'm recording this, they're working on the Blessed Sisters and the Fantasy Ratmen. The Blessed Sisters, I like a lot of their sculpts. Some of them aren't 100% there for me, but the Fantasy Ratmen, just wow. I was never a huge fan of the Skaven kind of uber chaosy aesthetic, and I get that it fits the lore, and that's fine. It just wasn't for me. But what OPR has done is it's less Skaven and more Redwall, more Rats of Nim. They look like regular fantasy soldiers who happen to be rats, which is really pretty cool, especially when you incorporate kind of the steampunk aesthetic that the Skaven already have in Age of Sigmar, and then port that to be more like what you might expect to see from Empire models in Age of Sigmar, or Warhammer Fantasy, sorry. I still use very dated terms when it comes to the fantasy games. Now, while One Page Rules hasn't covered nearly every faction they have available in the game, if there's a faction you want to play and you either don't own the models or don't want to buy the actual pre-produced models, they've done something really cool recently, which is they've started partnering with other STL creators and kind of integrating with them so that their products either match up with existing One Page Rules factions, or they have an entire kit that you can build your own faction with. They have a points calculator you can build your own stuff with. And so some of these other creators, Dragon Trapper's Lodge comes to mind immediately, they make their own little factions every single month. So the number of factions isn't even just limited to what's quote-unquote official. They're really opening the door and really kind of, and I know I use this term a lot in terms of this, but they're democratizing the space. They're doing things that are opening it up to more creators and allowing more people to get in on it. And I think that's fantastic. And that's a big part of the reason I think this is going to be a major part of the future of wargaming. We'll never be done with 900-pound gorillas, but the little guy has a much better shot now. Just to go through some of the other companies that do make one-page rules compatible miniatures, and I will actually just look down and read here. So we've got Fleshcraft Studio, Battle Yak, Lord of the Print, which is a big player in the 3D printing space, actually, Tablehammer, Dark Gods, and Crippled God Foundries. So they all have miniatures that are designed to fit within the current one-page rules factions. And then, like I said, Dragon Trapper's Lodge, they've gone the extra mile, used the OPR point calculator, and made their own bespoke factions for one-page rules, which is just super. I know I've sung the praises of 3D printing a lot, but 3D printing isn't for everyone, and even people who want one may not have access to one, just not work for them. In that case, I highly recommend, there are a lot of secondhand sellers of Warhammer stuff out there. You can almost always find some stuff pretty steeply discounted on eBay, especially if it's things that came in kind of one pose sort of configurations. And if you go that route especially, I cannot overstate how much less expensive it is to get into one-page rules than into any of the more established games. Like I said, the basic rules are free, the faction rules are free. You can buy the full rule books individually through Wargame Vault, and I want to say they're a few bucks a piece. I subscribe to their Patreon. If you want the STLs each month, I think it's $10 for the STLs and whatever updates happen to the rule books, to the main rule books every month. The $5 tier is just for the rule books, and and I forgot to mention the paper minis. They give you little templates to print out paper minis if you wanted to go that route. Speaking of Patreon, I have one of those. If you want to directly support the channel, there is a link below. If you don't want to or don't find yourself in a place where you can contribute directly and monetarily, likes and subscriptions are the currency of YouTube, so either or both of those would also be greatly appreciated. If you're a fan of one-page rules, let me know below. If you hate one-page rules and hate me for talking about it, definitely let me know below. Drive that algorithm. It has been really encouraging in recent months to see how many people out here in the miniature wargaming space are interested in alternatives to at least what I had been led to believe for a long time was the only option that was ever going to survive. Games came and went here and there, but it was always like, oh, well, if you want a game that's going to last more than a year, it's got to be Warhammer. And that's just not the case anymore. And I have really enjoyed expanding out and looking at some of those. And it's been very encouraging to hear some of you encouraging me to continue to do that. So here we are. And this is far from the last one. So stay tuned. And if you've got a favorite game that's along the similar kind of indie lines, definitely let me know below. Until next time, keep it simple, not stupid, and thanks for watching.